Welcome back. And yes, you can see both Caspar and I are here to welcome you. And I know that many of you will have had a very, very hard time recently, and it looks as if it's going on for some time. But we have been talking about death in many of the other programs, and so I think the important thing is that we keep in mind that certainly over 60s you have a slightly bigger chance of going to hospital, and if you do, then you may go into intensive care. At any rate, in hospital you won't be visited, and therefore if you do unfortunately happen to die, you'll die alone. Now this is important because it means that you have a chance in the next few weeks to get your family relationships right. Do you remember I talked about that just before you died, in the weeks before you died? One of the major things was getting your family relationships right and giving up the anger that you had to other family members. So this is a time when you can, in fact, practice that. I thought that I wouldn't go on with the amazing Alain Forget, and that we might look at how easy it is, if you're in this field, to take a blind turning. I've taken many, and you learn from them all, of course. What I mean by that is that you come across people, usually discussed by their friends or people who feel that they are in fact genuine. And so you have to be very careful and investigate them. And see what it is in yourself that has led you to be taken in. So then, the first time that I really came across a situation was when I was looking at consciousness. Oh, before we do that, let me just go through the books again. This is The Awakening of the Luminous Mind by Tibetan Meditation for Inner Peace and Well-Being. And it's a very nice book, and it's a particularly good one because it's an easy meditation. It's by Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. And I would recommend that, as it's a good book and will in fact keep you tranquil and calm, and much happier if you're able to do it. Then this is Alain Forget's book, which we're not going to discuss today. So, How to Get Out of This World Alive, The Philosopher. There's a picture of Alain. And we will see that when I was studying Alain, I had to set up a whole set of criteria for myself to make sure that I wasn't being taken in. This is your course book, which we are doing at the moment. It's Shining Light on Transcendence by myself and my wife, and it gives an account of my relationship with Alan, what he is, what I thought him to be, and then the science behind it. Now the last one is a book by Jeffrey Kripal, and it's called The Flip. And I don't know how many of you will know about The Flip, but what it says, it's epiphanies of mind and the future of knowledge. And I'm giving it to you because, do you remember we've been talking about non-duality and moving our levels of consciousness, and you remember that I was talking about Jeffrey Martin in California. Well, this is along the same sort of vein, that people come to a point in their lives when they flip, as he says, into a higher state of consciousness, a transcendent state. So it links up very much with what we're doing. Well, where do we start? I think the first time that I recognized that there was something in the relationship between me and the person which was very important was when I was at school. Now remember, this was a long time ago, and you didn't talk about consciousness then, you talked about levels of alertness and all that sort of thing. And of course there wasn't the internet, so you couldn't find anything out. So I went to the school library, and there was a book on hypnotism, and I thought that would be nice. So let's see what that's got to offer. And it taught you how to hypnotize somebody. And I was discussing this with another of my friends there. He said, would I hypnotize him? And I said, yes, of course I'll hypnotize you. What do you think? And so he did exactly what I said. I shone a light in front of him and then I told him to look towards the light, and I moved my finger just like we did in the book, and then told him he was getting tired and sleepy and going to sleep. And he seemed to do just that. I told him he could continue to hear me, and then I told him everything would get dark. And what I did was, that's Casper. There we are. What I did is I moved my hand in front of the light like that, so that he couldn't see it, and the shadow fell in front of him. Told him it was getting dark, and he entered a deep hypnotic state. Now, why should he do that? And it was because, and I didn't know and he didn't know, he's what's called a deep trance subject. And the deep trance subject is easily hypnotized and can go very deep. So he did. And so I told him his arm was getting rigid. He held it like that. And I said, right, I can't bend it. And I tried to bend it and I couldn't. And it was really a very impressive demonstration of hypnosis. And then I told him he was in his bathroom and he was going to take a bath. So he ran the taps. He didn't take his clothes off. He ran the taps and got into the bath and then washed himself all over like this. And it was a very impressive display of having a bath. And remember, I'm only 16 at the time, so it was enormously impressive, and there wasn't any YouTube or any way of getting information. And so then we had to go to a meeting, and so I had to bring him out. But I gave him a post-hypnotic suggestion, which is easy to do, because I said to him, you can hear me, you will remember what I say and carry out the action, but you'll not remember that I've asked you to. So you remember what you have to do, but you won't remember that I asked you to. And so I gave him a post-hypnotic suggestion that he would put his hand, I put his feet on a chair and shout out, "Alleluia." Well, this was a schoolboy thing, really, isn't it? And so I then woke him up in the usual way. On the count of 3, you'll wake up and be your normal self. 1, 2, 3, and he woke up. And so you can imagine that I was extremely interested, as were one or two of my friends, to see what happened the next day. Sure enough, at about the time that I had said, he very self-consciously looked around, put his feet on a chair, stood on the chair, and shouted, "Alleluia." Oh, amazing, absolutely amazing. So what that showed me, that it was something in the relationship between me and him And something which was very special about him, and it's something that I could activate in him through the method of hypnosis that I'd learned from the book. So that extended my understanding of consciousness just a bit. Now we get on to some experiences that I've had where the person involved wasn't always as truthful as maybe they should have been. The first one was Divine Mother. Divine Mother had a flat in London, and a lot of courtiers who were fully persuaded by Divine Mother. So they asked me if I'd go and see Divine Mother because they knew of my interests, and so I went to see Divine Mother, and we had a long conversation. I've noted with gurus that they tend to slag each other off because they're the best ones. And Divine Mother was very keen in slagging off the Maharishi, you probably remember, or certainly heard of. And so I was talking to her and said, could she do healing? Oh yes, of course she could. Now, could she heal epilepsy? Now, I chose epilepsy because it was my subject. I know a lot about epilepsy, its mechanisms of drug treatment and so on. She said, oh yes, wouldn't be difficult. So I said, would she heal some of my patients if they want to be healed? She said yes. So I asked at the local epilepsy society if there was anybody who'd like to be healed by Divine Mother, and 3 people came forward and said yes, very much they'd like to try it. So we all trooped into Divine Mother's flat, and she gave them a talking to and said that if they did exactly what she said, then there's little doubt that they would be healed. That's a good start. So she said what she wanted them to do was to buy chilies, fresh chilies from the market, and put them under their pillows, and to get a photograph of her, which she would sell them. And every morning when they woke up for half an hour, they must look at this photograph of Divine Mother, and the influence of Divine Mother would pass from her to the people, and it would be part of the healing process. After a week, she asked how it was going, and I said I didn't know because everybody kept a seizure chart. I wasn't going to look at it until the experiment was over. And they went on, but they had to, in fact, throw their chilies into running water. And so I said, would the Thames count? Because remember, the Thames is tidal, so it's back one way, back the other way, etc. And she said, oh yes, that was okay. So they threw their chilies into the Thames. They got some more chilies, put them on the pillow, and went on for another week. Then I got their seizure diaries and had a look to see if in fact anything had happened to their seizure frequency. And I'm sad to say that nothing had. So I told Divine Mother that it wasn't really working, and she said, well, we'll have a meeting. So I asked the people if they wanted to come and meet Divine Mother. They were getting a bit fed up by this time. Chilies under your pillow is a rather ridiculous thing to do. And certainly it'd be very difficult to see what the science of that is and how that would cure epilepsy, but be that by the way. Anyway, it was in the agreement, so we all met, and it was one of the days when Divine Mother had a long queue of people who come to see her and receive her blessing, which is fine. And when 3 patients with epilepsy came up in front of her, and I was there with her and said, Mother, these are the people who had been trying to heal with epilepsy, who you met before. And she said, yes, come here. And one of them came up to her, put her hands on his head, shut her eyes, and then said, you're cured. And I didn't think that this was likely to do anything, but who knows? What it did do was to make one of the people extremely angry, that he should have been taken in by this woman, and then when what she said didn't work, she had this sort of ceremony, and nothing happened. So the conclusion of that experiment was that Divine Mother didn't have healing powers in the way that she thought she did. Now, why does she go on saying this? I think for two reasons. One is that if you have a psychological problem rather than a physical illness, which they had, then her reassurance, her warmth, and her caring nature would probably reduce the significance of your symptoms. But if you had a physical illness, then I think it was not going to work, and that's exactly what happened. So, was she misleading people? No, I don't think so. I think that if anybody was being misled, it was her rather than the people, because I'm sure in some people she would get changes and healings, particularly if they had psychological illnesses. So that was Divine Mother. Would I have missed Divine Mother? No, of course not. I learnt a lot from Divine Mother, and that is to be much more careful about what you do with other people, and try and make sure as much as one can that there's good evidence that people who say they can do things can. Well, the next one was, again, a fascinating guy. He came from South Africa. I think he'd originally worked in India. At any rate, he'd had a heart, the first, I think, heart operation by the very famous South African surgeon who started cardiac surgery. And he was much improved by it. Then cardiac surgery was very new, and so the fact that he was improved said a lot for the surgical skills in South Africa at that time. Anyway, he came to England as a guru, and he made people look at a pattern. Now, looking at patterns as a meditation technique is okay. I mean, it can lead to deeper meditations if you choose the right pattern in the right way and so on. Anyway, so he gave people patterns, and he took a number of meetings where he expounded Indian philosophy, which he did very well. And in one of his lectures, I was told that he said that he could travel out of his body and get information at a distance. Well, now this is testable. So this is really interesting. So I asked him if he had come to the institute I was working in, where they had a video studio. Remember, this is a long time ago, so video studios were pretty rare. You certainly didn't have a telephone you could use. And we set up a meeting time, and he came, and I told him what I wanted to do, that I was really interested in whether or not he could gain information at a distance. And he said yes, he'd love to come along. So I videotaped him and asked him if he'd be prepared to do an experiment in front of video cameras. And he said totally happy to. And I said, what I would like you to do is to leave your body and go and get some information for me. And he said, yes, of course, I'll do that. and where would you like me to go? And I had actually taken the trouble to look at the time in Australia and the time in London, and it was dark in Australia at that point in time. So I said, well, why don't you go to Sydney Harbour? And he thought and said, yes, that would be wonderful. And so I said, do you want to do it now? He said, yes. So he shut his eyes, became very still, and then he said, I'm in Sydney Harbour. Good, I said. Okay, what can you see? Well, he described the sort of things that you would expect anybody in Sydney Harbour to see. The Opera House with its sail-like structures, the Sydney Bridge, and so on. And so I then said to him, oh, that's very good. Now, are there any big ships there? Now, I chose big ships because if you look at the shipping news, you will see where the bigger carriers are and what ports they are, and I already knew what ships were in Sydney Harbour. And he said, yes, and he described lots of sailboats and ships. Remember, it's dark there, and there shouldn't be sailboats and ships, but who knows whether there were or not anyway. And so I then said to him, look, can you see a big one, a particular big one? And he said yes, he could. And so I said, right, can he fly down and look at the name of the ship? Now, if he had either done his homework, although I'd chosen Sydney random, so I don't think he would have known he was going to go to Sydney. If he'd done his homework, he could have found a port in Australia and looked at the shipping times and come up with the correct name. But he didn't, and so he flew down, he said, and looked at the name, and I said, he could see the name. I said, oh, that's excellent. Can you tell me what it is? And he said, couldn't quite see it, couldn't quite make it out. I said, oh, that's a shame, a real shame. Go closer and have a look. And he said, no, it's no good, he couldn't see it. And at any rate, after a few more discussions about Sydney Harbour, he returned to London. So that was interesting. And, Casper, I hear. And what that tells me is that you can't always believe what people say, and it's best to have objective evidence if you can. The other thing that he said he could do was, I don't know if any of you remember, but one of the things the yogis can do, I'm stroking Casper. Well, I think you can all see Casper now. Come on, Casper. Come and sit down. That's a good boy. Yeah, what about that? One of the things that yogis can do is to remain awake all night. Now, that's fascinating. I very much wanted to test it and see if they really could. And I'd been looking for a yogi who said he could do this, and this guy said he could. So I said, would he be happy to come to my lab one night and sleep in the sleep lab? And he said, yes, of course he would. So we decided on a night, which was a week in advance. My technician was there ready with the electrodes, and I was there to welcome him, and in he came. And he was blowing his nose and coughing. And I said, I'm so sorry, how are you? And he said, well, actually, he got quite a severe cold. And I said, oh, well, in that case, I think you probably not better do it this evening, because I don't want you to lie down and cough all night and be uncomfortable. Fair enough. And he said, yes, you reckon that was better. And I said, but it's very important for me, and I think of interest to you, to find out what does happen when you sleep. You should be over your cold in a fortnight. Can I make an appointment for you to come? He said, yes, of course I could. So I made the appointment, but he never came. And so I don't know to this day whether or not he was able to, in fact, be awake all night. But I suspect, because of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, it was another thing that he had learnt, and there may be some part of himself that feels that he was awake all night, but I doubt in the way that the real yogis describe it. So, and I'll tell you about somebody else. He was an amazing man. He came from Africa, and no, I'm terribly sorry. He came from America, and he was the closest, I think, that I ever got to a real shaman. In other words, I think he did have powers, shamanic powers. What does that mean? That means somebody who comes from a background and has been trained in the use of his mind in different ways in the West. And of course, a lot of shamans take drugs, but there's nothing to do with drugs here. And I met him, thought he was an interesting guy, and then after about 6 months the opportunity came to work with him, do an experiment with him. And so I thought again I ought to meet him, and he was living in Rome at that time. So I went to Rome to one of the hotels, and he said he would meet me there, and he gave me strict instructions. I was to go up to my room, I was to lie on the bed, and I was and he would talk to me, and then he would give me further instructions. So this I did, and he came in. He'd been riding a motorcycle and had his helmet with him, and he put it down and talked to me. Interesting guy, actually. And he had a sort of feeling about him. I don't know if you recognize this, but he had a sort of feeling of something unusual about him. And he said, what did I want? And I said, I just wanted to transcend and see the divine. You might think that was a very funny request, but I wasn't all that old then. But nevertheless, if he could make me transcend and see the divine, that would be amazing. Instead of saying no, he didn't think he could do this, what he did do is he said, okay, you could do that. So lie on the chair and lie on the bed, I'm so sorry. And he would do this. Now, I was interested, slightly apprehensive, lay on the bed, and he was behind me, and he said, you must not turn round and look at me. And so I said, okay. And I lay on the bed. Then came most amazing noises from behind me. He was making, as if he was chanting spells and doing other things. And I found myself getting very, very sleepy. And then when I came out of my sleep, he'd gone. So he obviously had induced sleep in me without too much difficulty. Was I different? Yes, I actually was. And that night I had really quite a deep transcendent experience. The next day he said he'd come back, which he did. He asked me about my experiences and repeated the procedure. I went to sleep again, and when I woke up, the following the rest of the night and the following day I was in an altered state of consciousness. I mean, there's no question about it. And yes, I was part of the universe. I understood things quite differently. And Rome took on a completely different sort of feel. That lasted for 2 days. And he also gave me a phrase which I had to learn. And of course I couldn't learn it. So he wrote it down and he said, "You're not to show this to anybody, because it's a very powerful phrase. And I never write these things down. You must promise me that you will eat it, or eat the piece of paper it's on, when you've learnt it." And so I said, "Yes, of course." And the phrase, which I can't remember now, was a phrase which would break up aggression in other people, and if somebody was seriously injured, it would help them through the injury and stop them from dying. So it was a very powerful incantation, if you like. So, at any rate, I learnt it. And I was in London, close to our house, and there were some people fighting across the street. So I said my incantation, and nothing happened. And it was also a time when we were going to Canada, and we were on the Canadian Pacific Railway, and there was a big crash up front of the train, and we could hear the noise of the train running over something. It turned out to be a car, and the person who was driving the car was in fact seriously injured, so I took this opportunity to help him if I could. And he finally died. I think he was really quite seriously injured. And after those 2 experiences, I don't think I used it again. And I couldn't tell you what it is now. I mean, if I looked through my old papers, I could probably find it. But no, it didn't really work. Now, the other set of experiences are those who do have the most amazing experiences and are happy to talk about it. Now, there's always something said in yogic meditations, etc., that if you have an experience, note it and let it go. So you don't talk about it. By talking about it, you tend to make it stronger. At any rate, the person I met at dinner one evening, and her name was Thetis Blacker. She has died now, and she had an amazing experience when she was youngish, in her early 20s. She is an artist, a very, very capable artist. And I asked her if she would tell me about her experience, and she said yes. And so she told me that on this particular day, there was no different from any other day. She got up and she went out of her house, and she went into the middle of a nearby field, and suddenly her perception of everything changed. The light that she fell onto the field was that of divine love. The soft wind which brushed across her face, she describes as like the flames of Pentecost when it sat on the disciples. And she felt that she was the whole one with the whole universe, and there was no her looking at the universe and the universe out there. She was it. And this automatically led me to think that she was non-dual, although I didn't know it at the time because non-duality was not a concept we were talking about. And when she came back, she said she tried to write it down, but of course there were no words, and that's a very important statement, because if you're in a wide non-dual state, you don't have words to express it, and this is one of the difficulties of communication. The people who have non-duality, the difficulties that they experience in trying to make other people understand what happened. So I've met a number of people who've had experiences like that, and this book here, which is The Flip by Jeffrey Kripal, is a nice, interesting book because it is the flip is people who flip into a transcendent state, and they stay in it for varying lengths of time, and in some it's permanent. So in fact I think they become non-dual. So there we are. It's rather different for you from the usual talks that I've been given, but I think it's a good one for now. One has to remember that these are, of course, very difficult times that we're going through, and we also have to remember that our friends and family are absolutely central. And so, as you will be doing when you come to die, if you don't die of the coronavirus, which you won't, of course, you will put your relationships right. It's very important. So I would do that now. I'd make sure that you've talked to your relatives, and that you're happy with them. I would say this, wouldn't I? And that is that, have you in fact made your wills and so on? But we've been talking about death. I'm not suggesting that you're going to die, but I am suggesting that you want to be ready for anything. And so get your wills in place, make the decision where you want to be buried, and all those sorts of things. So have a really nice week. Hope you enjoyed today. Something slightly different, a little bit of experience for you. And I look forward to seeing you in about a week's time. From Scotland, where we are now, with lots of sheep and mountains and snow and lakes all around us. So see you next week. Thanks very much.